What's good, y'all? Welcome to this Harvard School of Public Health's Center for Health Communication Creator Briefing. We are so excited to have you all here today as part of the Harvard Chan Creator Program that empowers an alliance between public health and creators like you. To give you a sense of how this is going to go, we will run through introductions first and then spend 15 to 20 minutes delving into the science before we get into audience questions. All of the information that we discussed today will be available and shared in an accompanying toolkit that the Harvard team will send out after the briefing. One more quick call out. Feel free to drop your questions into the comments section as they arise, and we'll get to them in the Q&A portion. So my name is Jessamyn. I'm Jessamyn Stanley. I'm a yoga teacher, content creator, and writer. I co-founded The Underbelly, and I'm the author of the books Everybody Yoga and Yoke, My Yoga of Self-Acceptance. I teach yoga and meditation all over the world, and I've been sharing my yoga practice on the internet for over a decade. Content creation to me is the most important tool that marginalized people can use to tell our stories and be seen. In my mind, it is crucial. Being able to tell your story, especially now when the world is so chaotic and there's so much opportunity for misrepresentation, it's of the utmost importance, not just so that you can feel seen on an individual level, but so that we can provide visibility for anyone who doesn't see themselves represented in the mainstream. That visibility often can be the difference between life and death. And content creation, in my opinion, has the opportunity to bring new life forth and change the world for the better. I'm excited to be here today because to me, the intersection of public health and content means that we have an opportunity to rewrite biased and harmful narratives about health and wellness that limit our capacity to take care of our bodies and build healthy communities. Now, let me pass it over to Stephanie Yeboah.
Thank you so much, Jessamyn, and thank you, Harvard team, for this amazing briefing. Hi, everybody. My name is Stephanie Yeboah. I am based in London in the UK, and I am an author, speaker, content creator, and a body image advocate who has been doing this since about 2008. I am also a content creator that advocates for fat acceptance, and in 2020 I wrote a book called Fattily Ever After, which is part memoir and part sort of book that features on the experiences of Black plus size women and how it relates to the body positivity movement, the origins of the body positivity movement, and the ways in which Black fat men across the world deal with things like family, lifestyle, dating, and everything that kind of encompasses that. I'm excited to be here today because I think the intersection of mental health and content has been a great way for me to be able to share my stories with people that have gone through similar things. And as somebody that comes from an African background where talking about mental health and talking about emotions and how it relates to bodies is seen as quite taboo, I have been able to utilize social media as a way to share my story and to try and help others who come from similar backgrounds to me to talk honestly and frankly about their mental health without feelings of taboo or feeling like as if they're not able to talk about their stories. And I think I'm really excited for today's briefing because I think being able to have these discussions and discourse on body image and fat phobia through content creation means greater accessibility for people who may not have the voice or people who may not feel seen, to be able to see themselves in others sort of living their best lives or, you know, having the courage to overcome certain things. And yeah, today's expert, Dr. Puhl, can help us all empower even more community and advocacy online. So on to you.
Well, hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca Puhl. I'm Deputy Director for the Rudd Center for Food Policy and Health at the University of Connecticut, where I'm also a professor in the Department of Human Development and Family Sciences. And for about 2 decades now, I have been studying weight discrimination and weight stigma and how it impacts children and adults and different strategies that we can implement in our society to try to reduce this form of bias. And I'd just like to thank Stephanie and Jessamyn and Harvard Chan for having me. And thanks everyone for joining today's briefing. I'm really glad we're having this conversation today. And I'll just start by saying that body weight is a complicated topic in our culture. And it remains a very common reason why people face stigma and mistreatment. And for a lot of people, it's also a very emotionally charged topic that can be challenging to talk about. But I do think it's safe to say that many of us are really exhausted from harmful messaging that hyper focuses on thinness as the expectation or standard, or for attractiveness or for health. And I think it's also frustrating when activists like Jessamyn and Stephanie, who challenge this messaging and who advocate for body size diversity, are met with ignorance or hate. And I think that highlights just how challenging this topic is. And for myself, as a researcher who's been studying this issue for a long time, it's really clear that multiple societal remedies are needed if we want to eliminate weight stigma. And as part of that, we need to have effective communication that can really change the harmful narratives that exist about body weight and messages that reinforce stigma. So to make communication about weight more empowering and more evidence-based, we really need to prioritize ways to reframe this conversation. There are certainly different ways to do this, but I think one way is to first recognize that weight discrimination encompasses a lot more than just name calling or teasing, that this is really a systemic structural problem that results in inequities in employment and healthcare and education in our society. It's also a very prevalent problem. We know from national research studies that as many as 40% of American adults have experienced weight stigma in their lives. And yet, despite how common this is, weight discrimination essentially remains legal almost everywhere. So in the United States, for example, in every state except for Michigan, there are really no statewide legal protections against weight discrimination. Our research has shown that there's a lot of support, public support, to pass these laws, but we're just not really seeing policymakers champion this issue or recognize weight discrimination as a legitimate social justice issue. I think another aspect of reframing this conversation is really also contextualizing the health harms of weight stigma. So certainly we've seen a lot of research studies linking body weight and health, but a lot of that research ignores discrimination that people with higher weight face and how that contributes to their health. So, for example, we know that weight stigma contributes to emotional distress like depression and anxiety, to physiological stress like elevated cortisol levels, to disordered eating and cardiovascular disease risk. Some research has even found that there's a 60% increased mortality risk for people who experience weight discrimination, and that's independent of their BMI. So reframing the conversation requires messaging that weight discrimination is harmful, that this does not help or incentivize people to be healthier. And Stephanie, I know that you've written some personal and thoughtful pieces about this, and wondering if you can share a personal example of how this messaging has impacted your own well-being. Have we lost?
I think you're muted, Steph.
Muted. Apologies for that. So sorry.
It looked so exciting. I was like, what's happening?
I'm so sorry. Yeah, so thank you so much. And yes, I have basically, when I was 14, I was diagnosed with depression at quite a young age, and that was due to the onslaught of the types and friends, but also from people at school, where I was constantly told that I was too big, and even going to the doctor and them almost using shaming tactics lose weight. I was told from an early age that I needed to join Weight Watchers. And I think at the time, I think I was even below the age that you could join Weight Watchers, but there was a lot of pressure for me to lose weight at a very, very young age. And so growing up with people constantly telling you that the way in which you exist is wrong had a detrimental impact on my self-esteem. I became incredibly insecure. Like I said, I was diagnosed with depression. And also what it did was I actually started to eat more because of the emotional impact of being told that I was too big, I was too fat. And I actually developed this case of emotional eating, which then just made me put on even more weight. And so it became this cycle of body shaming and fat shaming, and me dealing and processing all of that guilt through eating even more and developing really negative ideas of my body. I did go through really bad eating disorders, trigger warning. There may be some mention of trigger warning of eating disorders here, but I did go through that period of disordered eating from the age of about 16 to about 23, which was heavily encouraged by people around me, because there is this stigma that fat people can't have eating disorders because of how we look. And when we do look at the issues of eating disorders, we normally see that the poster child for people that have disorders are normally slim women. And so because people didn't know the ways in which I was eating, but I was drastically losing weight, it was heavily encouraged for me to continue what was actually quite detrimental to my health going on. So these are things that I started to share online in terms of my own journey with seeing myself and seeing how others saw me, as me living and existing in this body being a problem. And so I was taught to hate my body at a very, very young age.
I really appreciate you sharing that, Stephanie. I think your experience is shared by so many people, and it also, everything you just said aligns with all of the research that has been done in this area, whether it's how prevalent these experiences are for kids and adolescents, how much it can affect their emotional well-being and also their eating behaviors. I mean, one of the things that we've seen in our studies is that weight-based teasing and bullying in adolescence predicts emotional overeating and emotional eating well into adulthood, that this is really a very long lasting and harmful experience. And I think a lot of the points you've touched on are ones that will resonate with a lot of people who've experienced the same thing. Something else that you kind of alluded to that I think is worth talking about here as kind of another aspect of this messaging that needs to be reframed is how oversimplified the narrative is about weight and health. And we see that so often in the media. You know, our society has been very, very focused on body weight as a defining measure of health, when the reality is obviously that health is multifaceted. It goes far beyond the number on the scale or a person's body size. And we know that health is influenced by a lot of factors that we cannot see by looking at a person. You know, their blood sugar levels, their cholesterol, their stress, their physical activity or sleep patterns or substance use. And so even though, you know, we know from science that the reality is that health is very complex and multi-determined, we continue to see media messages that really reinforce just these oversimplified narratives about weight and health. And Jessamyn, I know that your work kind of directly fights oversimplified narratives of health. And how do you best empower people's understanding of this in your own storytelling?
You know, honestly, so much of it is about showing that, and so using myself as the example, like showing that I am a whole human being, but really like in a more general sense, showing that like fat people are people too, that we are like whole human beings that are not just the way that we look. And so in terms of my storytelling, I like to center my storytelling with a narrative that is pretty much the opposite of whatever the mainstream is saying about fat people in our lifestyles. Like, I didn't grow up with a lot of representation of people who look and live like me. So it's really important to me to show what it looks like to live a healthy lifestyle as a fat person. And for anyone, just to show that health is not just the way that you you look, it's not how you exercise, it's really how you take care of yourself holistically. And I think that this is, I can go into a whole thing about where this is coming from and why the Western world is pushing this particular narrative. But what I can say in short is just that being fat isn't just about the food that I eat or the food that I don't eat, but it's also about the way that I dress, the way that I move my body, the things that I say to and about myself. I really think that language is one of the key ways that we belittle ourselves, and it's one of the key elements of weight discrimination. And the normalization of hateful self-talk is something that allows for these biases and stigmas to be so prevalent. And so that has been really central to all of my storytelling and content creation, is really thinking about the language that I use to talk about myself, and then seeing how that impacts people around me as well. It's also really important for me to talk about things that we never really hear fat people talk about, like sex and sexuality is one example of something that I rarely hear discussed in the mainstream at all, and certainly not by and about fat people. So that has become something that I'm really passionate about as well. And normalizing and destigmatizing conversations about every part of the human experience, not just the parts that are socially acceptable, I think that is crucial to dismantling weight discrimination. And usually the only time you hear anyone talking about fat people is, it's always about weight and health. It's about the before and after picture. But fat people are just as complex and interesting as anyone else. So to me, it is a critical part of the work to uplift and tell stories that are not about weight and health, because that is how we can write these new narratives and move toward fat acceptance in a more substantial way. So just to dive deeper into the language piece of this, I want to go back to that. I think thoughtful language also plays this really critical role, especially because different words mean different things to different people. So I've been using the word fat a lot. Personally, for me, learning to comfortably use the word fat has been an incredibly powerful and important part of my journey of self-acceptance. I do not think it's not the case for everybody, but I have found that fat is one of those words that people are absolutely terrified to use. Like, I think people are more afraid to be called fat than they are a lot of things, like a lot of four-letter words. They would rather be called than being called fat. So for me, it was, is, and probably will always be one of the most important words that I can use to describe myself, because reclaiming it in its just base level definition is a huge part of standing in my own power. And like, in these years of content creation and being in the public eye, I cannot tell you the number of people who have balked at my use of the word fat. And it's extremely common for people to ask me if it's okay for them to use the word fat, like, especially if they are not fat. Or if they should say like plus size or curvy or overweight or obese. And the word obese has a stigma all its own as well. And this is actually something that there's a lot more information about in the toolkit. So after this, if you want to check that out, I think it's really interesting to think about. I'm not in charge of what words people use. Other people, I'm not in charge of the words that they use about me or to me. But in my opinion, words only have power if we let them. And using the word fat has been a powerful catalyst, not just in my own life, but in the lives of the people around me as well. But of course, everyone feels differently about this. Stephanie, what language feels best for you?
Yeah, so for me, I am exactly on the same page as you. I started sort of self-referring to myself as fat maybe, I want to say like 3 or 4 years ago. And it came at a time when I felt the most confident about my body, and I had accepted my body in the state that it is, and sort of loved myself for who I am. And I realized that it's something about reclaiming the word, taking the power out of the word. Because what I noticed was, you know, being a visibly fat Black person online with an opinion you can get a lot of trolling and, you know, things of that nature. And as somebody that's been online for a very long time, anytime I would have an opinion about anything, whether it was body image or not, you know, the trolls will come out in full force with people. The first thing people would say is, you fat this, or you fat this, or whatever the case may be. And I started using fat for me because if fat is the worst thing I can be as a human being in terms of that person's insult to me, then I feel like I'm doing pretty well as a, you know, as human beings go. If the worst thing somebody can think about me is that I have fat on my body, then I'm just like, okay. And so if somebody comes at me to call me fat and I respond saying, yes, I am, now what? That person normally has no retort. They don't know what else to say, because I have taken what they've said and have acknowledged that, yes, I am fat. So what now? And so I started doing it to be petty at first, to kind of get back at the trolls. But now it's a case of, yes, I am fat. Fat is a word that holds so much power, not because of the actual word, but what the word means, what it encourages people to do. It's used as a weapon. It's a word that has become synonymous with undesirable, with ugly, you know, with all of these sort of negative things. So it's not so much the word itself, it's what that word represents for a lot of people who still are fat phobic, for the fat phobic societies that we live in. And I think that's one of the main reasons why this word has been so stigmatized. But for me, I think more of us play word and literally nothing can be. I feel very, because I don't see it as a negative thing anymore. And, you know, it's not used as a weapon anymore. So for me, that's been the best when it comes to people, how to use the word. I think it's just being curious about what, for instance, I do have people that are slimmer who ask me, like, to be termed, and I like that. I like the fact that they're asking me, you know, or they're asking, you know, to be described. So yeah, the most important thing is of how people describe themselves, and then before using the word, maybe asking them, you know, is it okay for me to say this or that? But yeah, Dr. Puhl, do you have any sort of further thoughts on language and how you feel about it?
Yeah, you know, I think this is such an important topic of discussion, because there are a lot of diverse perspectives when it comes to the words that we use to talk about weight. And this is something that my research team has actually done a number of research studies, really trying to examine what are people's preferences for different words to describe their body weight. And you know, what we see is in a number of the kind of the general population studies that we do is that a lot of people prefer neutral terminology, like words like weight or higher body weight. We see sometimes that words like obese and fat are typically more disliked or viewed as stigmatizing. But we also see that people's preferences really vary based on their gender, their race or ethnicity, their body size, what kinds of experiences they've had related to their weight or weight stigma. And so I appreciate what you're saying, especially in terms of really acknowledging this diversity and respecting people's preferences, and avoiding making assumptions about what words to use. And I think that's a pretty easy thing to do in a one-on-one conversation with someone, because you can just ask a person what their preferred terms are for describing their body size, and then use those terms in your conversations. Where this gets more challenging, though, is in the context of broader communication, because you know, we are just not at a place in our society where there is a single word or phrase that is universally acceptable and that everyone feels comfortable with. So I think, you know, given that we're talking about content creators and how to talk about this issue, that it's really helpful to consider your audience and kind of the focus of your message. And number one, whether body size needs to be discussed, but if it does, really thinking about what words those are going to be, perhaps defaulting to more neutral words for a broader audience. Um, things like saying things like people with higher weight, which is typically more acceptable across multiple groups and disciplines. But if you're talking about a specific person or interviewing a certain person, then using their preferred terminology, I think is really important. And this is a timely topic in a lot of ways, but interestingly, the Associated Press actually just recently updated their guidelines for journalists this spring, just a few months ago. And their guidelines acknowledge diverse perspectives on weight terminology, and they really encourage the press to use people's preferred terms in their reporting. And so I think that's a sign that there's some increasing awareness of just how important language is when it comes to weight, and that, to me, that's a little bit of progress. More broadly, though, when we think about ways to tackle weight discrimination, it's not only the words that we use to describe weight that we need to focus on. We also need to be looking for opportunities to directly challenge stigmatizing communication in the media, to advocate for actions to reduce weight stigma. Obviously, one way to do that is to advocate for policies that would make weight discrimination illegal. I think that social media platforms can be a really powerful way to increase that activism. When we think about social media, in the context of body weight, we usually think of social media as a very harmful source of misinformation and messages that promote fat shaming and weight stigma. And that is certainly true. But social media can also really be a place to change that narrative and to challenge the stigma. For example, I think one of the most common messages that we see getting communicated is the narrative that people with higher weight deserve shame and blame because of stereotypes that they're either lazy or lacking willpower or discipline. We also see kind of the body and redemption narrative, which is the idea that people will transform kind of how worthy they are of things like happiness or health or respect through their weight loss journey. And those are just a couple of narratives. There are so many, though, especially on social media platforms. And I'm wondering, both of you, I'm curious, what ways have you seen weight-based stereotypes kind of show up in social media or even on your own pages in particular, and how you've coped with that?
So it is just so interesting to me. I really have to be reminded of the world outside of like the body positivity, fat acceptance bubble, because I really turn to social media to find the role models that I did not have in my regular life. And it's just so interesting to me the way that the flip side is also true, that there are so many harmful narratives that are there as well. But I think this is really an argument in favor of very careful curation of what you allow into your space, because I have so thoroughly curated my digital world that I really don't engage with anyone who is spewing like a lot of diet culture stuff or weight loss talk. And so even whenever we talk about like a lot of these trends that are up right now, there are a lot of weight loss trends right now. I'm always like, we're still doing that in 2024? I forgot, literally. So anyway, but yeah, I mean, these stereotypes are everywhere. And when I encounter them, they're just a reminder to me of the boxes that we put ourselves in and the boxes that society puts us in. And there are a bunch of stereotypes listed in the toolkit. I've seen all of those stereotypes so many times, both on my own page and on social media in general. I think that if you put yourself out there, if you're talking about being fat and black and queer on the internet, you are gonna get a lot of people offering negative opinions and or negative stereotypes about that, stereotypes that I perceive as negative. And like literally all of them, the shame, the blame, the body as a spectacle. I'm noticing more and more this like body redemption stereotype though, because there's a definite rise of fat people like losing weight and proving how worthy they are now that they've lost weight. And I mean, honestly, I think there's a lot of ways that that particular trope is kind of played out in my own work as well, because I talk about health and wellness and yoga. I think there's a way that that can be perceived or tokenized as like, look at how healthy I am, look at like that, and that proves me worthy somehow, that I'm not like those other fat people. And like looking at that as an idea, I'm just like, oh my god, wow, just I'm like, I hate that that's, but I, again, going back to how like stereotypes are just reminders of the boxes that we put ourselves in, and that um, it only relates to you if you think it relates to you. Um, yeah, I also see that trope though of the body as a spectacle played out all the time on my own page and other fat creators, because a lot of times people will follow us literally in exactly the way of like looking at us like we're in a freak show, or like they're trying to pass judgment on our lifestyles somehow. I can go on and on about literally all of these stereotypes, but the way that I cope with them is just recognizing that no one is a monolith. No one is perfectly encapsulated by a stereotype. And if someone is projecting a stereotype onto me, I have to sneeze. And you know, like how when you have to sneeze and it's like coming? Anyway, if it comes, it'll come. If someone else is projecting a stereotype onto me, that is about them and not about me. And it only has to affect my life if I want it to. And I'm saying that, I feel like I'm saying that like it's easy. It is not easy to do that. I find that to be incredibly difficult. But I also think that it's the price that you pay when you live your life in front of other people on social media. People are going to judge you and project their stereotypes onto you, and it's up to you to decide the impact that that will have on your life. And it's interesting though, because that is also then an opportunity to share with other people who are experiencing that kind of discrimination in their own lives, like people who are on social media and on a day-to-day basis they have people projecting stereotypes onto them. If they see me as a content creator dealing with that kind of bullying, it can give them, just at a minimum, it's visibility, it's representation. You are not alone. And I think that that feeling of not being alone can be the survival that's needed to make it. What about you, Stephanie?
Yeah, so for me, I feel like not only have I seen quite a few of these stereotypes play out online, I've even sort of been a part of a couple of those stereotypes actually, which I will sort of get into. But I definitely agree with you, Jessamyn, about the body and redemption sort of before and afters that we're currently seeing, or that I've been currently seeing sort of over the last year or so, where we're having a lot of, people with fat bodies, dramatically losing weight, and then which, if they're doing that for their own personal reasons, that's fine. But what I have sort of taken issue with, I suppose, is the 360 as it regards to the messaging. So it's one of those cases where, when they were bigger, it was, radical fat acceptance, your body is amazing, all of these kinds of things. And then with the weight loss comes, it's bad to be fat, you shouldn't be doing this, your health, your health, your health. And so it's that messaging that suddenly gets flipped once the person has reached an acceptable standard of beauty as it pertains to size, that has been sort of disappointing to see. I know that with me personally, over the last year, I've lost a little bit of weight because I've been going to the gym more often, and I've kind of chosen not to really talk about that, or talk about, I may show my gym workouts, but I do it from a place of how to adapt certain, weights when you have a stomach or when you have a pouch, or easier ways to do, I don't know, dumbbell push-ups if you've got bigger arms. So for me, it's all about adapting certain workouts and making it more accessible for people that are bigger, as opposed to, look at me and look at how much weight I've lost, and all those kinds of things. And so for me, I've been very strict in curating my feed to not see endless stereotypes as it pertains to the redemption body. for me, I remember when I first started doing this work, I was very much that creator that was a bit of a deviant. So I would go out of my way to create, you know, really, I wouldn't say shocking, but sort of out there photos and images of my body, whether it was my stretch marks or my rolls or my hyperpigmentation. And I would do these images as a way to kind of shock myself into seeing it as normal. And the reason that I did these pictures was to kind of confront myself, confront my inner fat phobia, whatever the case may be. It was kind of like a shock therapy for me, because I was so used to avoiding seeing myself in the mirror and not looking at the areas of my body that I perceived as flaws, that when it got to a point where I was ready to start this journey of self-love, I had to confront these pieces of me that I saw as flaws. And so as somebody that loves photography, I was like, okay, I'm going to take a close-up picture of my rolls or my stretch marks and put it out there for people to see. And so looking back now, I can see how that maybe placed itself into the stereotype of sort of, you know, being fat and unapologetic and loving yourself. And yes, in one part that is a positive stereotype, but then it is still a stereotype sort of nonetheless. And another way in which I've seen it play out is through dating and desirability. And I almost see when I've witnessed the engagement that fat women have when they have a partner that is socially acceptable, there is a level of sort of dehumanization that fat women have when they're partnered in the ways that fat men don't have. It's almost seen as a spectacle. You see the engagement on social media rise, where it's people, and half of the people that are engaging are fat women themselves saying, oh my gosh, maybe, you know, if you can get a partner that likes you for who you are, then maybe I can. And then the other half are trolls or people that find the concept of a fat woman finding love so weird that they engage with that person's content, meaning that their followers go up and things like that. And I think, yes, there are some creators that play into that. And then there are some who choose not to show that part of them, of their lives, to social media because of the kind of the weirdness sometimes that surrounds the happiness that a fat woman finds when, you know, when they are partnered. And so for me, navigating it, again, it's just curating, and it's sort of not choosing to see that kind of content into my timeline, because sometimes it does, it does make me feel a little bit weird.
Yeah, I mean, both of the examples that you both just shared, I think highlight, first of all, just how common these narratives are, but that they can also be kind of tricky to navigate. And I think this just reinforces, you know, how important it is to be tackling the narratives that are reinforcing weight stigma and to openly talk about them. These can be pretty challenging issues to take on, particularly when we think about how the body is both politicized and the source of individual health, and how profit motives can drive societal views and values about body weight. So, you know, what advice do you have for other creators on how best to incorporate this content?
I think it's best to really tap into your audience. So for me, every few months or every few weeks, I like to open up my question box on Instagram to ask my audience, you know, like, what kind of things would you like to see from me? Whether it's, you know, fashion, lifestyle, all of those kinds of things, but from like a weight perspective. I think it's so important to really listen to what your audience want, for the most part, while still keeping true to the things that you talk about. Because I think in a space now where we are seeing a lot of body redemptive, having your audience who are with you from the beginning up till now, if he has changed in any way or not, it's still important to be able to share messages of your own messages without coming across as too toxic, as feels to toxic positivity. So saying things like not trying to encourage your followers to have to love their bodies every day, because what I find is that's one of the main reasons why people are now sort of going off body positivity and going to body neutrality, because there is a sense where people feel like as if they're being forced to have to love themselves every day, and they have to wake up in the morning, and they have to do these, you know, affirmations. And the reality is that every day is a different day as it pertains to how we see our bodies. So for me, you know, self-love is not linear. There are going to be days where you go up and down, and for me it's important to share those down days and to share those up days, because nobody is positive 100% of the time. So for me, when I'm talking about weight, I really like to drum in the fact that you don't have to be positive about it all the time, because it's not realistic. There are days where it's going to be where it is going to be a tough day, but as long as you can acknowledge that that day has been tough and just say, you know, this day does not define all of the work that has gone into loving my body, then that's fine. So for me, I find just checking in with your audience, making sure that the messages that you're saying are not sort of super toxic with regards to telling people what to do, and then just making sure that I'm using the correct language, or the language that I feel appeals to me. And yeah, I think that would be the main thing for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is such a I think that whenever you're creating content, and I'm saying creating content, but honestly, I think this is like whenever you're being a human, whenever you're putting yourself out there, I think there's this desire to represent more than yourself. Like there's a desire to be like standing on a podium, a pedestal, and be like, I have it all figured out. And that is just not the case for literally anyone ever. And so, my only advice, literally, and this is about this particular topic, but I think just with content creation in general, is to lead with vulnerability and authenticity. Like, that is what people are looking for when they come to your work on social media. I think it's why people get on social media in general. Our lives are so wild that like you retreat to this world in your phone or on your computer to feel like you're connecting to something real. And what is real, what will really resonate for people is whenever you're tapping into your most true self. And um that is scary, I think. And I think that that is really the challenge with content creation, and is to try to get to a place where you can be just existing as your most authentic self. And whatever your journey is with weight discrimination, like maybe I'm so curious if there's somebody watching who is very anti-fat and is like that's what I want to talk about. That's real. There are people who for whom that resonates. Like keep it real, be honest. Like if you're on a journey with yourself, I think that part of the issue for me personally with a lot of these like reclamation stories of fat creators who are like who were really body positive and now are like basically like saying that they've changed their mind and that they now have this whole new narrative about it, is that it's like there's a lack of authenticity there, or there's kind of this like, what's going on? How do you really feel? And maybe that is authentic for them. And honestly, I think that's probably the case. But whatever your personal opinion is, the more that you can be honest and authentic about it, the more that's how you'll be able to connect with your community. And I do think it's important to be aware of the language that you use and why you're using it and what that language means to different people. But that can only really take you so far, because the language is really going to be whatever resonates for you personally. Excuse me. What's most important is to keep it real, because that's why social media exists.
Yeah, you know, I feel like we're just scratching the surface here. I feel like we could really continue this conversation for hours. I know that we're getting short on time and we need to open it up to some questions. And I see here, I believe we have a question directed to both of you. If Steph, if you want to read it and maybe respond first to this one.
Yeah, sure. So we've got Rafaela, who has asked, as content creators, are we making enough of a difference by posting photos of our fat bodies and speaking about body acceptance and fat liberation, it can sometimes feel like those of us who talk about body acceptance and fat liberation are in an echo chamber. Are we just reaching people who already agree with us? Are we making enough of a difference? How can we change the narrative? I think this is such a brilliant question, because I have been feeling this way for the last 6 months, actually, in that it just feels like there is such a regression when it comes to the movement. That it just feels like everything from the promotion of, weight loss drugs, to removing plus size outfit pieces out of the stores, and restricting plus size clothing again, it just feels like we're going back. And so for me, although it feels like we are in a bit of a hopeless place at the moment with regards to fat liberation, I will endeavor and continue to push forward with it, because even if it's just one person looking at my content and feeling seen, then that's enough for me. I know it seems as if there is this trend of the redemptive body, and we're seeing loads of people, losing weight and things like that. But it's great that we can also have these kinds of spaces where people are able to access conversations on fatness and fat liberation. I've also done a couple of other panels for universities where they've spoken about this exact subject, and it just seems like this isn't something that would have taken place 2, 3, 4 years ago. So it does feel like the advocacy that we're doing is making somewhat of an impact for schools such as Harvard and other universities to actually to take this seriously, and for us to have these kinds of conversations. It does feel like we're still making somewhat of an impact. So even though we feel a bit restless, or feel as if like we're not reaching the right audience, it's hard, because there's the emotional labor that we're constantly having to do. But for me, it's something that I still want to kind of plow through and just speak and shout as much as possible, using our creativity to kind of break through certain avenues. I've just finished writing my first rom-com novel, and the main character is a US size 28. And for me, that was important, because we rarely see fat women being the love interests in novels and TV shows. And so for me, I'm trying to use my advocacy in those ways creatively to try and really push the agenda forward in terms of self-love and fat liberation. So for me, I think it's worth continuing.
I want to add that I think that it's really important with any kind of movement work to take a bird's eye view of it, as opposed to this really micro perspective. And I think that, like, when you're in the trenches and you're doing the work, and especially when we're talking about social media, where so many of us, and I just really want to, I'm speaking for myself, look to social media as a place to receive validation and to be like, oh, I'm doing a good job or I'm not doing a good job. That when you are in it on a day-to-day basis, it's really easy to feel this like, well, shit, does any of this even matter? Is it reaching anyone? And especially when we look at like engagement and analytics. But if you take a step back with any kind of movement work and you look at it over, I mean, we can look at it over the course of a year. I think that with body acceptance, it's really interesting to look at it over the course of a generation. So looking at it for like 10 to 20 years, the shift in the past 10 to 20 years, I want you to just take a moment. Remember 2014? That was like a moment ago. The difference now between now and the way that things were in 2014 is dramatic, to say the least. Just looking at the way that I mean, even just Steph, what you're saying about like what you've written in your rom-com, like that is going to be the new norm. That like, and we're seeing this shift in media that is, granted, if we look at how it is true that there is this regression happening in fashion specifically, where brands are like not investing in plus sizes, they're not catering to our demographic in the same way. I think that that's temporal. Like, I really think that we're in a period where it is extraordinarily important for us to continue this work, because then we will start to see an upswing again. If you look at fat acceptance, so I'm talking about the last like 10 to 20 years, but if you think back to when fat acceptance really got going, which was a part of, it came out of second wave feminism. So we're looking at like late 60s, 70s. The shift from the late 60s, 70s to now is tremendous. And if you look at that large of a time period, there are definitely periods in there where like it's ebbing and flowing and like things are not as great, and there are periods of big growth, and then there's periods where there's not as much growth, and that can be seen and said for every single social movement. So if you look at the civil rights movement, if you look at queer rights, if you look at disability justice, that is there as well. So I think that for us as activists, as creators are like the front line of activism in fat acceptance. I think that it's really important for us to take the long game, see the long view, and understand that you may have months, maybe years where your content is not hitting, but for somebody, even that one person who sees it, it's life changing. And if you think about it as that one person is not, it's not just them, it's their whole community. So they are a ripple effect. So as a creator, looking to the individual, that if you have one follower, one subscriber, that's all you need to worry about, is that one person, and be there for them. And then whenever they leave and they go on and they do whatever it is that they're going to do, as they will, they will ebb and flow too. You just keep doing you, and there will be another. Because, and it is also helpful, I think, to remember that like one person, if one person likes your content, they're really representing like at least 5 people who like the content. So yeah, play the long game and know that it's bigger than your lifetime, and that your impact is so much more than you could ever even imagine. I could really rhapsodize about this for days. I'm curious, Dr. Puhl, if you have any thoughts about that before we move on to the next question.
Yeah, I think just to add on a couple of quick things, certainly we have seen progress in social media and media more broadly in terms of representation, but there's a really long way to go. And from a research perspective, this is a topic that a lot of researchers have studied, and across all forms of media, really. And we really do need to see better representation. We need to see more respectful depictions, more realistic and meaningful stories of people with diverse body sizes, and we need to see those stories that are inclusive and fair and nuanced, and that really portray people with different body sizes as multidimensional human beings living multifaceted lives. And I think we're still missing that in a lot of media. So there's a lot of work to be done there. The only other thing I would mention is that I think, kind of thinking forward, we need to bring more content creators and academics and researchers together in this conversation. There's a lot of really good research being done on weight stigma, and we need to be engaging in these topics. When there isn't communication between these two entities, I think it's easier to have stigma persist. And when we work together, I think there are a lot of opportunities to really make a bigger impact.
Okay, I think this will need to be our last question for today. Kalita Himes asks, what are your thoughts on the BMI? I hate it so much and wish doctors wouldn't rely on it. It feels like such fat shaming. Dr. Puhl, I'm so curious your thoughts about this. My thought, so having been on a journey of body acceptance for a long time, the vast majority of my adulthood, I have kind of come home to the fact that the numbers are not who I am. So if a doctor is giving me, so that when a doctor gives me information, it is just that, it's information, and I can know that information. It doesn't have to be the definition of my identity. And I think that we have for so long looked to medical institutions. We've looked to institutions in general to define us, but particularly looked to medical institutions to give us that validation of like, you're good or bad, like this matters or it doesn't matter. And to me, it's like, okay, you can give me that number, That's helpful to know. It is not my entire identity. What am I going to do now knowing that number? I can put it out of my mind. I can use it to make different choices for my health. And this is something that I think I would really like to see a lot of movement around this within medical institutions, is understanding the role that doctors play in self-worth of their patients, and understanding that there's an opportunity to help a person feel seen and feel validated, while also giving them information that can be helpful for their health. Um, a lot of times, I think we get so afraid, and I hate to even use a plural, I want to say I get so afraid of receiving the information that I won't go to the doctor or I won't seek out the information. And that, I think, is the danger zone, because there is helpful information there, but that self-worth piece just doesn't have to be tied to it. And to me, particularly in terms of who I'm going to go see, that's really what comes up for me as a question, is like, I'm in the power position as the patient. And I think there has been this idea that the doctors are in the power position, but it's like, who's paying who here? I'm paying you. So if I go to a doctor and they're fat shaming me, then I'm not going to continue to go to that doctor. I'm going to go to a different doctor. And I think that's really the key, is understanding yourself as a powerful human being with self-worth, and that you can make the decisions that you want, and that you can find a doctor who, and I don't want to make this sound like it's easy, because there are not enough resources to help us find the people that we need. But you can find a doctor that is not going to fat shame you. A lot of doctors don't use BMI and don't use weight, and are not, and even if they are, they know how to offer that information in a way that is actually genuinely helpful for their patients. So I guess, just to get back to the question, the original question, I relate deeply. I do not prefer having my self-worth distilled into a number that is questionable, whether or not the whole history of BMI is there are there's a lot of racism within it. So like there's a whole questionable system there. But I think that understanding that my worth cannot be represented by a number, any number, is crucial. But yeah, I am really quite curious, Dr. Puhl in particular, if you have any thoughts about this.
Yeah, you raised a lot of good points. And I mean, the topic of weight stigma in healthcare is a really big topic. We've done a lot of research in that area. But just to respond to the question about BMI, there actually is quite a lot of increasing recognition in the medical community that BMI is flawed. And in 2023, just last year, the American Medical Association announced a new policy recognizing the limitations of BMI as a measure of health, and recommending that it really only be used in conjunction with other measures of health and risk, like metabolic factors and body composition, because they recognize that BMI misses important health information that really can't be determined by the number on the scale or looking at a person's physical appearance. So I think there is an increasing shift happening right now, recognizing more of the complexity of health, and recognizing some of the limitations of BMI that you just mentioned. I know we're going to try to get to one last question here. Steph, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. And just my quick one on BMI. Yep, I hate it, hate it, hate it. I think it should be abolished, and I think it should take less of a backseat than the other ways of measuring health. So I just wanted to put that in there, because BMI has been used as a reason why plus size women cannot donate their eggs or undergo IVF, which I think is inherently cruel and wrong. And so I think there should be another method. But yes, so going on to the last question from Rebecca. She's asked, how can creators in smaller bodies help challenge anti-fat bias and promote fat acceptance without centering themselves? This was essentially the focus of my whole book, which was talking about body positivity and self-love, and how the movement had been sort of taken over by mid-sized and smaller sized women who centered themselves in a movement that was predominantly for a safe space for fat women. The ways in which you can do this are to amplify creators that have bigger bodies, whether it's retweeting, resharing, having conversations with, using your privilege and your platform to highlight the people who may not be as heard as much as you. So what we tend to see a lot of the time is smaller creators or smaller fat creators tend to have higher engagement or higher followers because they exist in bodies that are more palatable to what the media likes. So that gives them already an increased platform. And so what you can do is to use that platform and share it with other creators that may not reach the same demographics that you would. I think that's a very easy way to do it. And then I'll be frank, another way in which I think we can, you can use your platform is to, and this is just a personal thing with me. I get that other people might have no issue with this whatsoever, but whenever I see smaller fat creators doing these things online where they sort of really hunch over and clasp at a role to try and let their followers know that, I'm fat too. I live in a marginalized body too. That is very condescending, I think, to a lot of people, because as somebody that lives in a body that has a lot more privilege than fat bodies, to contort your body in a way to let your followers know that you also, live with whatever it is you're trying to peddle, so to speak, can be quite insulting, I think. So this whole narrative of people, in socially acceptable bodies, contorting their bodies to look fatter, to spread a message, only to go back to their very normal bodies and live their daily lives. I think that kind of stuff doesn't help, and is quite condescending. So yeah, my main thing is to use your platform to spread the messages of people that are fatter and have messages as well.
Great, thanks, Steph. And I'm looking at the time. I see we're out of time here, and that we need to wrap things up. I'm sure we could keep talking about these topics for a long time. They're so important, and we've really just scratched this. But thank you for sharing your questions and for attending today. I'd especially like to thank Jessamyn and Stephanie for sharing their experiences and expertise, and the Harvard Chan Center for Health Communication for hosting today, and the Social Current for their marketing partnership. Please do keep an eye out in your inbox for the accompanying toolkit based on today's discussion. And thanks again so much for being here.